Welcome back. In this particular segment, we're going to be looking at the second chapter of the Moynihan report. And in this particular chapter, we'll be looking at the Negro American family. Now, last week we talked about some of the pertinent issues surrounding the deterioration of the Negro or the African American family. But before we get into chapter 2, as we always do, we're going to do a chapter review. We're going to look at some of the noteworthy things that we should take with us from chapter 1 as we go into chapter 2. So now let me get the image up. And so we find out from the very beginning that the movement has a very, very profound effect on the United States. It mentions that it's one of the most important movements in the history of the nation. And that movement had international implications, which means that in other areas where people were having to face inequality and prejudice and racism, they were using the same methods that they saw being employed in the United States. And as a result, many of them were having the same good results. And as we went on through our discussion in chapter 1, we saw that because of the efforts of those that were taking the lead in the civil rights movement and the way that it was done in a nonviolent way, Dr. Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And that was given to him for things that he had done in the past, the work that he had put in to try to help to heal the breach in the United States. But then it was also a wish of sorts, a hope that the work that Dr. King did would continue to help individuals to find peaceful solutions to the difficulties that they had in the United States. But then we noticed that the government got involved. We noticed that at this particular time, it would seem that the full force of the federal government was now aimed at trying to solve some of the difficulties faced by the African American community. And it really fell into three basic classifications. The first one is the political events. The organization of the movement was seen and appreciated. And then we see that the federal government begins to commit its resources to finding a way to give equality to African American citizens. And then as if to show that the nation was behind this effort, in 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson was voted in as president. And so, as I mentioned, this was almost a signature by the nation to say that they were ready to deal with the difficulties that faced the African American community. Now, that was the first classification. Now, the second one is administrative events. And we see that the president there enacted the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. And so what that was geared toward helping individuals to get ready and be prepared for employment. Then number 2 is the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. And then the third one is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So all of these three that are mentioned had nationwide implications. They were done on a national level. We're trying to help individuals to be prepared to take on employment, and then we're fighting poverty. We're trying to get rid of individuals having difficulty because they live below the poverty line. And so all of those things were national efforts. And then, of course, the Civil Rights Act was a national effort as well. It had national and far-reaching implications. Now, what about the legal events? Well, in that particular section, we found out that the whole decade of the 60s was marked by a distinct viewpoint of the Supreme Court that they would strike down any legislation that came before them that dealt with inequality or that produced inequality among the citizens of the United States. They were geared toward helping to promote equality. And that's exactly what they did. And proof of that is the Brown versus Board of Education decision where segregation in regards to education was struck down. Then we got into the discussion of liberty versus equality. And right off the bat, we found out that individuals who would die for liberty, die for the right to be free, some of them had no intention of seeing equality for all of the citizens of the United States. And you would think that liberty and equality, because they are the two fundamental bases for American society, you would think that they would be the same. But we found out that in some situations they are diametrically opposed to each other in some instances. And so when we talked about equality, we found out that there were two kinds of equality. The first one was the equality of opportunity, which meant that individuals had the opportunity to line up at the starting line. They would not be prevented from engaging in the races and the competitions of life. They would be given that opportunity. And this is actually, as the paper mentioned, the way that white America viewed equality. Everyone would have an opportunity to run in the race, and they would finish that particular race based on the qualities that they had, based on their own abilities, right? And then we're introduced to the equality of outcome. And in describing the equality of outcome, we took upon ourselves the illustration of the individual who starts at the starting line. He's been given a place where he can run. But then as the race starts, he is guaranteed that his outcome will be similar to another runner. And so in equality of outcome, what you're looking at is that you want the same results for one group as you see in another group, right? And so the two differing thoughts, the equality of outcome and the equality of opportunity, really symbolize the difference in between how the African American community looked at equality and how white America looks at equality. Okay? And then at the very last subheading, we found out that one of the things that really stood out was that the structure of the Negro American society within the United States was beginning to deteriorate. The paper mentioned that it was in the deepest trouble. And so in chapter 2, we're going to go into what is the foundation of these difficulties that we see that causes the social arrangement of the African American community to start to fall apart. Okay? So now, let's get into chapter 2. As we mentioned, the title of it is The Negro American Family. So right off the bat, we see that the deterioration of the fabric of Negro society, as we mentioned, is really tied to the deterioration of the Negro family. The paper helps us to appreciate this is the fundamental weakness of Negro community. So the African American family is in crisis. And because the African American family is in crisis, then the African American social order is in crisis also. So now, the paper goes on to help us to appreciate that it's a difficulty for whites to perceive the effect that 3 centuries of slavery, exploitation, and things of that sort has had on the Negro social order. And why is that? Well, because the thrust of the civil rights movement had to do with equality. It had to do with discrimination. It had to do with poverty. It didn't really have to do with anything that touched upon the fabric of Negro society, which is the Negro family. And so it's easy then for individuals in the white community to perceive that things are going along well. But is that the case? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because the paper mentions that unless this damage is repaired, all the effort to end discrimination and poverty and injustice will come to little. So if the difficulties that the African American family faces are not brought to a conclusion, or if there is no suitable solution found to help the African American family, then all of the work that was done by the civil rights movement is going to be undercut. It's going to be worthless. Because if you don't have an African American society, then there is no need to campaign for equality. There's no need to campaign for discrimination or for equal housing or for better education. None of that matters if you don't have individuals involved in families who benefit from the crusade to have equality, right? So now the paper goes on to say that the family is the basic social unit of American life. It is the basic socializing unit. And so what does that mean? The basic socializing unit. Well, in society, individuals interact with each other, right? And the family unit is used to help individuals to understand how they should interact with one another. And so within the family, we're taught principles, we're taught things to believe in, where our character is built. And those particular principles that we are taught should enable us to be able to effectively deal with individuals in society, right? But now, if the fabric of families is starting to deteriorate, how can those individuals that come from those families successfully deal with society in general? So that's what the paper means there by the basic socializing unit. Families socialize us so that we'll be able to get along with individuals outside of our homes. It says that by and large, adult conduct in society is learned as a child. So the things that you do as an adult, right? The habits that you have, the principles, as we mentioned, the values that you have as an adult are taught to you as a child within your family. So now, as far as a psychoanalytic statement, the paper helps us to appreciate that a child learns a way of looking at life in his early years through which all later experience is viewed and which profoundly shapes his adult conduct. So notice that part. In his early years, right? He learns a way of looking at things. He takes on a certain perspective. And that perspective shapes the way that he looks at reality from that point on. So let's say, for instance, the way that you look at things or your perspective is tainted, maybe with poverty. Then the rest of the time that you're alive, you look at things through the lens of poverty. You look at things as an endeavor always to try to have the resources that you need, because people who are stuck in poverty, that's their main objective, to have the resources that they need to survive for that day. And so it's easy to see why an individual who's raised from a child in this particular situation and environment can come away thinking that life is only about acquiring the resources that you need to survive from day to day. That's what we mean about an individual being seeing things from a particular perspective because of the way that they were raised as a child on up until adulthood. Okay? And then because of the fact that the American social structure seems to be so well put together, people tend to assume that the nature of family life in America is well organized, peaceful, right? And whatever the differences is in family life has nothing to do with a different family structure. So what's being said here is that there is a standardized family phenomenon in the United States. And what is that phenomenon? We refer to it now as nuclear families. And so the majority of individuals in the United States at that particular time had nuclear families. And so this was, as the paper described, an standardized phenomenon, nuclear families. And so it makes it easy to see that if an individual came from a different structure in regards to their families, how that things could be difficult for them. Whereas everyone around you was raised with a mother and father in the home, providing instruction, providing security and support for their children. Maybe you were raised with only a single parent mother. And so the dynamics that you approach life with are very different from the dynamics that a person approaches life with who has two parents in the home. And so this is the phenomenon that the paper is talking about. And so really America at that particular time had produced a recognizable family system. But now there were some differences. There were some differences, as we mentioned, in family structure. Now the paper gives an example. There were different family patterns that were noticed in the age of the great European migration to the United States. Individuals that survived that particular period of migration, it mentions that it was notable that these individuals had closer family bonds, right? And so because they had closer family bonds, then it goes on to say that they progressed more rapidly than others because of the family bonds that they had. But then also, the paper makes mention that the variations in family life account for notable differences, notice this, in progress and assimilation of various ethnic and religious groups, right? So these variations that we're talking about are variations from the American family phenomenon, which, as we know, as we just mentioned, the nuclear family. And so there are variations from that. And to the extent that a person varied from that particular pattern, then they experienced difficulty in assimilating into American culture, being accepted into American culture, being able to move around in American culture and not be afraid of consequences that could possibly happen. So that's what that particular issue is. And it's addressed in this particular article. And it's seen that that's that's a problem. Because the next paragraph goes on to talk about the variation between the white family structure and the African American family structure is a discontinuity in family structure. And so that discontinuity is something that has to be faced. It's something that has to be worked out, because the variations that exist there within the African American family when compared to white families is significant. It can't be denied. It mentions here that the white family has achieved a high degree of stability, and they're maintaining that high degree of stability. And so you achieved stability. So that means that there's a husband and a wife raising children in a family, most likely in a home. And the stability that exists is because everyone is geared toward making sure that the family is a success. And this is not only something that's pushed in the family, but then is pushed to the extent that that's what's passed on. The value of family is passed on from generation to generation. But by contrast, the paper makes this very, very clear. And it's even in bold. Notice what it says. By contrast, the family structure of lower class Negroes is highly unstable, and in many urban centers is approaching complete breakdown. Highly unstable and approaching complete breakdown. So what are we saying? What are we saying? When looking at white families, mother, father, children, right? But when looking at African American families, at this particular point in time, it says that it was highly unstable. So that means that there might be the existence of father, mother, and children, right? But because this is not something that's stable in the community, at any time it could fall apart, right? And it mentions that it was approaching complete breakdown. So what would we consider to be complete breakdown when you look at the family arrangement? Complete breakdown. Would it be the absence of a father? In this case, I think it would be. Because if the man is to be the head of his household and he's primarily responsible for protection and provision, if he's absent, then that most definitely would promote the breakdown in family structure. So there's considerable evidence then that there is starting to be a division in the African American community at this time. There's starting to be a division. And that division is middle class African Americans are starting to separate themselves from lower class African Americans. And in this particular instance, the upper and lower class has nothing to do with the values of the individuals, but their class in society, which is a lot of time determined by how much wealth they have, right? So there's a stable middle class that's starting to emerge, right? And it's starting to get stronger and stronger and grow more steadily. While at the same time, the paper helps us to appreciate there's an increasingly disorganized part of our community that's starting to rear its head, where there are individuals who are disadvantaged than in the lower class. So, in that middle class, though, something that was noteworthy and something that was maybe unseen, even in white families, the paper mentions that there is a higher premium on family stability, and notice this, and the conserving of family resources, and that's more than middle class white families. So middle class African American families are more concerned with family structure and being able to pass on resources to the next generation, even more so than middle class white families. And so that's an important thing that we look at. Now, there are at this point 2 things that we need to look at. 2 things. And these things are very pivotal, so I want you to pay attention, okay? And I'm going to try my best to make sure that you understand what these 2 points are. So come along with me. The first one is that the emergence and increasing visibility of a Negro middle class can beguile the nation into believing that circumstances for the rest of the Negro community are the same. They're equally prosperous, as the paper mentions. So, to make that a little bit more clear, because of the fact that the Negro family, or the African American middle class family, is growing so steadily, and because of the fact that it's well known that this particular class of people is growing more steadily, it has the tendency to overshadow the fact that there are still families that are living below the poverty line. There are still African American families that are in need of assistance. But because of the fact that the middle class is growing so fast and it's so prosperous, it overshadows the fact that there are still individuals in families who face poverty. That's the first thing. That's the first point we need to keep in mind. Now, what is the second point? Now, this is very interesting. I must admit, when I first saw it and read it, I said, okay, I can understand what's going on here. So if we were to lump all of the individuals of the African American community together, so we're talking about individuals in the middle class and individuals who are in the lower class, if we lump them all together, right? And then we statistically took measurements of the progress of the community as a whole, then that would conceal the disorganization and the difficulties of the lower class group that existed. Because as we mentioned, the middle class is making so many strides. They're moving at such a fast rate that when averaged in, it would appear that there's stability in the African American community. And that's a false assumption. That's a false assumption. And so if with the middle class, if they're moving and they're progressing at such a fast and rapid rate, they overshadow the lower class, then if we average those 2 together, then we'll find that there's no difference. And like I mentioned, that's something that is a fallacy, right? The paper mentions that the resulting statistical averages might show no change. And if it shows no change, then it's not accounting for the lower class African American families who, as we mentioned, are in the grips of poverty. So what they do now is explain the way that this particular paper approaches those statistics. It says that the statistics on the Negro family and most other subjects treated in this paper refer only to specific points in time. and they do not measure the experience of individuals over time. Okay? So at a particular point in time, this is the statistic that we're giving to you. Could it be higher? Absolutely. As time progresses, it could be higher. As time progresses, it could go lower. But at this particular point in time, here is the most recent statistic that we can offer you. Okay? And then it goes on to talk about, and we'll read this part, the average monthly unemployment rate for Negro males for 1964 is recorded at 9%. 1 point in time, 9%. But during 1964, some 29% of Negro males were unemployed at one time or another. So at one point in time in 1964, the unemployment rate for African American males was 9%. But if you track throughout the whole year of 1964, it more closely approximates to 29%. So that's the basis of the statistics that we see in this particular paper. And then it gives another example. It says if 36% of Negro children are living in broken homes at any specific moment, it is likely that a far higher proportion of Negro children find themselves in that situation at one time or another in their lives, right? So what is that saying? 36% are living in broken homes at one specific time. They pick 1 point, right? But now, as we mentioned, that particular percentage could be higher or lower, depending on the circumstances that present themselves over an extended period of time. So those are the basis for the statistics that we see in this particular paper. And we are going to get into some statistics. Next week, we're going to get into them. And the next subheading is entitled, Nearly a Quarter of Urban Negro Marriages Are Dissolved. Breakdown of the African American family. That's what we're seeing. And that's what we're going to be discussing. Well, I hope that you enjoyed this first subheading of the second chapter. We're going in depth into see how it is that the Negro family is being affected, really Negro society, African American society in general, and how the deterioration of the basic socializing unit, the family, in the African American community in 1964 is affecting the overall African American society. Well, as always, man, we hope that you enjoyed this segment. Please come back next week as we will be getting into more information in regards to the Moynihan report. As always, man, be easy.